Pickett's boots crunched across a thick layer of snow and ice as the Russian squad marched him at gunpoint towards their field HQ. His arms were bound tightly behind his back, suppressing shivers that had nothing to do with the biting Arctic winds whipping across the devastated town. All around, the aftermath of the brutal fight for Narvik was laid bare. Smoldering ruins, craters pocked from relentless bombardment, and the twisted wrecks of vehicles littered the frozen streets. The dead from both sides lay where they had fallen, stiffening bodies clad in NATO armor and Russian Gore-Tex, faces frozen in rictus masks of their final agonizing moments. A brutal reminder of just how quickly regional conflicts could spiral into all-out war. 72 hours ago, Pickett had been half a world away, enjoying a crisp New England autumn and the thought of Thanksgiving leave. Now he found himself a prisoner on the front lines of World War III, having witnessed firsthand the horrific reality of urban warfare. Memories of Deacon's self-inflicted demise kept replaying in his mind. The young Marine had made his choice when faced with the reality of capture, powerless against the inevitable interrogations and tortures that awaited at Russian hands. Had he taken the coward's way out? Pickett couldn't decide. All he knew was the sound of that gunshot would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his days. "Keep moving," a harsh voice barked in Russian as he was shoved forward by the butt of a rifle. Their destination was coming into view, what had once been a parking garage, now repurposed as a fortified bunker amid the ruins. Sandbags lined the entrance and defensive positions were dug into the surrounding rubble. Patriot anti-missile batteries were set up at key points, their radars scanning the skies for any sign of incoming ordnance. Pickett's hands were bound behind his back as he was marched inside the dim, cavernous space. Off to one side, he spotted a series of chain-link pens erected hastily, makeshift holding cells for other NATO prisoners captured during the fighting. Their sunken eyes and haggard expressions revealed the harsh treatment they'd already endured at Russian hands. "Should have eaten that bullet when I had the chance," one of the British soldiers muttered hoarsely as Pickett was dragged past. "Ain't no coming back from what they got planned for us." The Marine was ushered into a separate room, an ad hoc command center of folding tables strewn with maps and comms gear. The CO of the Russian detachment was waiting, attired in a heavy parka and fur Ushanka cap as he clasped his hands behind his back in an almost casual manner. "So, this is one of the vaunted capitalist protectors of democracy, huh?" the Russian officer sneered in thickly accented English. He waved dismissively at Pickett's Marine Corps insignia. "Your American bully boy antics have come to quite an unpleasant reckoning here in the Arctic, wouldn't you agree?" When Pickett refused to respond, the officer grinned wolfishly and produced a pack of Russian cigarettes from his coat. He tapped one out and lit it, taking a long drag before continuing to address his sullen captive. "Perhaps you did not get the memo, but the old world order is falling apart. Russia will no longer be bullied or threatened by your NATO attack dogs. We take what is rightfully ours, and remove any obstacles in our path by any means necessary." The Marine shifted slightly, his jaw clenched in consternation. Whatever this Russian piece of filth thought would happen, NATO forces would not simply roll over. Seeming to read Pickett's thoughts, the officer chuckled grimly and leaned in close, wisps of acrid smoke wafting across his weathered features. "I thought the same bravado would drive your forces when we first struck. But now your soldiers cry and soil themselves as we break them, piece by piece. They thought us weak from the long sleep of the Cold War. They thought us unwilling to pull the trigger. The officer sneered, tapping his cigarette on a nearby ashtray. Did you enjoy your petty victories today, Untermenschen? Celebrate while you can. Because very soon, everything west of the Urals will once again be under the Russian bolt. On that menacing note, he waved for his guards to take Pickett away. The Marine offered one final glare of defiance before the butt of a rifle impacted the side of his head, leaving him crumpled and bleeding into the dirty concrete floor. Over the coming weeks, he would become all too familiar with this waking nightmare, trapped behind Russian lines as NATO forces fought tooth and nail to blunt the invasion. Through several more stints of unconsciousness and hazy torture-filled delirium, vague news filtered down from their captors' radio chatter. Russian armored spearheads were driving deep into the heart of Scandinavia as elements of the Red Army and Spetsnaz units infiltrated farther west. By late January 2025, the Blitzkrieg had smashed to within 40 miles of Oslo before finally being ground to a halt through sheer desperation by combined Norwegian and British reinforcements. Much of central Norway, however, remained occupied territory. It reminded Pickett of the darkest chapters from World War II, when Stalin's purges and Nazi death camps stained humanity with an indelible pall of evil. Now it seemed history was doomed to repeat itself again in this frozen, forgotten corner of Europe. Only this time, they would have front-row seats to the atrocities. Amid the overcrowded, vermin-infested pens, despair and sickness took an inexorable toll. The few remaining able-bodied prisoners were routinely taken for beatings and interrogation sessions, their wills and bodies broken piece by piece for meager scraps of tactical intel to feed the Russian war machine. More than once, Pickett found himself hovering near death's door. Only the knowledge that somewhere beyond these walls, NATO remained unbowed and unbroken kept him fueled with a last flicker of hope. The old Guard regiments and Cold War veterans of both sides were settling scores at last, drawing pernicious new lines across the geopolitical maps with their own blood and sacrifice. There was simply too much at stake. The peace and prosperity of the entire European continent hung in the balance. NATO commanders would never allow the Russian aggression to gain a lasting foothold. Sooner or later, the armored fist of the alliance's combined might would strike back to retake the occupied territories. Of that, Pickett had to keep faith. So he endured. He watched friends and comrades breathe their last in that festering pit of despair. He took beatings, indignities, and torture that would have destroyed men less tempered. And through it all, he clung to that singular hope that one day, the thunder of NATO artillery would herald their liberation. The Ruskies would soon see what being backed into a corner entailed. It began in early spring of 2025, nearly 6 months after Russia's initial lightning strike into Norway. Scattered reports of renewed missile strikes and tactical bombings were followed by tremors from beyond the horizon, the unmistakable distant drumbeats of heavy-caliber guns and massed armor movements. The Russian officer, now firmly ensconced in Narvik and emboldened by reports of their forces digging into entrenched positions across Scandinavia, affected a sneer of casual disregard. The lapdogs of petty kings and tin-pot capitalists make their last gasps of protest. They will be swept aside and brought to heel just the same. Mother Russia will once again reap her rewards of conquest. But the muffled percussions continued, steadily growing closer and more intense over the following days. Whenever Pickett managed to gain updates from a new batch of prisoners brought in, the news was better than he had dared hope. A massive NATO counteroffensive was indeed underway. Bolstered by the combined military might of Europe and North America, fresh waves of armor and mechanized infantry were pushing deep into occupied territory, retaking villages and towns in a steady grind. Chemical and smoke obscuration rounds began falling over Narvik itself, signaling the coming assault. Russian air defense batteries feverishly launched volleys of SAMs into the oncoming storm, swatting down waves of incoming ordnance in blossoms of shrapnel and detonations. But for each missile or bomb destroyed, dozens more seemed to swarm through, driven by an implacable tide. 5 days and nights of constant bombardment raged, reducing the occupied city to little more than ash and rubble. Underground bunkers and hardened shelters became the only refuge from the unrelenting barrage. Communications with Russian high command grew increasingly disrupted and unreliable. "They've jammed our secure channels and cut off our supply lines," the Russian officer bellowed, slamming his fist against a maps table as the compound shook from another nearby detonation. "Without reinforcements or air support, Narvik is indefensible." He wheeled on Pickett, who remained defiant despite his battered state. The Marine was currently bound to a support pillar amidst the makeshift command center, having endured another session of enhanced interrogation at the hands of his captors. "You must have known this would happen, didn't you, dog?" the officer snarled, flecks of spittle flying from his twisted features. "Your fascist NATO forces throw their resources into one final, pathetic gambit to stall the inevitable." Pickett mustered what remained of his strength for one final display of resistance. He sucked down a ragged breath, coughed up a thick gout of blood and phlegm to splatter across the Russians' combat fatigues, and grinned. "Just the opening salvo, Rusky jackboot. Johnny NATO's comin' to knock you back under whatever rock you crawled out from." The officer's face purpled with rage as he drew his service pistol, pressing the muzzle against Pickett's forehead. The Marine tensed, refusing to allow his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. "Perhaps I'll simply put you down like the rabid dog you are." The blast doors to the command bunker clanged open, accompanied by a torrent of gunfire that cut down 2 guards who stood in its path. Through the smoke and haze strode a figure in battle dress, the iconic arrowhead emblem of a Ranger battalion boldly emblazoned across his armored chest plate. 2 more Rangers followed behind, sweeping their weapons across the command center and dropping to firing stances. Within seconds, they had neutralized the remaining Russian personnel with a combination of gunfire and concussion grenades. "Told you they were comin', asshole," Pickett coughed, slumping against his restraints as the officer turned towards the new threat with pistol raised. The man never got a chance to pull the trigger before a 3-round burst punched through his chest in a blossom of gore. His body crumpled to the floor, limp and lifeless. Pickett's former tormentor addressed the lead ranger with a curt nod. "LT, room's secure. Found one freebie still kicking." He gestured towards the bound prisoner. "I'll be damned," the ranger lieutenant muttered, shock registering on his grime-streaked features. "We were told there were no more possible survivors." He quickly crossed over and began cutting through Pickett's restraints. "What's your name and unit, Marine?" "P. Pickett," the battered man rasped, fighting to stay conscious. "Pickett, Deacon D, Sergeant Squad, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines." Well, I'll be go to hell, the ranger grinned fiercely. The one and only dead box Pickett. You cocksure son of a gun, we heard you boys got chewed up something fierce during the initial push. Once freed, Pickett crumpled forward, only kept upright by the strong arms of the Rangers. His body felt like a tower of spent ammunition casings, muscles screaming in agony after what felt like an eternity of torture and deprivation. The lieutenant turned to one of his men. Get this Marine back to the casualty collection point. He's going to need a couple weeks rack time before he's back regulating. As Pickett was lifted onto a makeshift litter, the concussions of ordnance and sporadic gunfire reverberated through the compound. It seemed that NATO's final push to retake Narvik and break the Russian foothold in Norway had truly begun. He looked up through eyes that refused to stay focused, searching for any other familiar faces that may have survived this frozen purgatory. Gunny, Deacon, is anyone else? There might be others scattered through whatever piss-puddle hovels those bastards were keeping prisoners, the lieutenant said grimly. But you look like you were the only one still catching kicks when we hit this place. I'm sorry, Marine. Pickett drew a ragged breath, his mind graying as he finally allowed what was left of his reserves to slip away. At long last, he could stop fighting, stop enduring, he was going home. Just make it count, LT. Don't let those Russian FF fucks. As he finally blacked out, the thump of artillery and muzzle flashes filled his fleeting vision. NATO forces were on the move, and nothing would stop them from scouring the Russian cancer from Europe once and for all. This was more than just the next campaign, the next battle objective to secure. This was the rebirth of the Cold War's embers. An ideological line in the sand beyond which the expansionist aims of Vladimir Putin's neo-Soviet empire would not be allowed to spread. No one knew how far the fires of war would need to burn before Russia could be contained. But as Pickett surrendered to his injuries, he held one fervent hope echoed by every free NATO nation. No matter how long it took, Russia would be made to lose.